Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
The Russian response to Ukraine's use of U.S.-provided ATACMS missiles across the border, striking offensively against Russia, which prompted a reaction from Vladimir Putin, lowering the threshold for a nuclear strike in response to a broader range of conventional attacks. Now, the U.S. response right now is no response. As I mentioned earlier, it recalls the movie War Games. The only way to win is not to play. But it's pretty hard to not play when things are unfolding before your eyes like this. And that's where we want to start our conversation with Chuck Fleischmann, the Republican congressman from Tennessee's 3rd District, is with us live from Capitol Hill right now. Congressman, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. I'm supposed to ask you about this funding deadline, and we'll get to that. I have a lot of questions about the lame duck, but you have an important viewpoint on this story as co-chair of the Nuclear Security Working Group. And from your position with your specialty in energy, I know you're focused on this closely. How important, how dangerous is this development today that you're seeing coming out of Russia with a new nuclear doctrine?
This is very dangerous. The rhetoric from Vladimir Putin over the past several months, including today, has been very dangerous in terms of threatening the use of a nuclear weapon. This should be condemned universally across the world, because we cannot have that kind of talk coming from any of the nuclear leaders in the world. Russia has a nuclear arsenal. I can assure you the United States has the best, strongest nuclear arsenal. I fund it through the Department of Energy, the NNSA. We are well prepared, but we want to make sure that we lower the temperature and have a strong statement that there can never be the use of a nuclear weapon, even a tactical nuclear weapon, a smaller one, on the battlefield. It would escalate beyond what we could just even fathom. It's ridiculous. It's wrong. It must be condemned.
What do you make of the response, the non-response, if you will, from the U.S. Congressman? And how worried are you that Vladimir Putin will try to take advantage of the remainder of the Biden administration to do some damage here before Donald Trump is in office?
Well, I can't wait for January 20th to get here. This is why I believe that President Trump will get in, sit down with Zelensky and with Putin, and bring this horrific situation, this sad chapter in world history, to a close. But the reality is we've got to be very careful day to day. We do not want this to escalate, to spread, and God forbid, we do not want to see the use of a nuclear weapon on the battlefield or anywhere else. That's why we have a strong nuclear deterrent in our country. That's why we have built that up. But for Putin to engage in this type of rhetoric is wrong. He needs to pull it back.
Well, do you think this strengthens, the use of the ATACMS strengthens President Zelensky's hand if he is about to approach the negotiating table with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, assuming that happens? Because when we look at the map of territory that's been occupied by Russia, that seems to be a lot to ask for the Ukrainians. In fact, they say they won't entertain handing that land over, whether it's the Donbass or Crimea. What do you think?
Well, there's absolutely no question that on the ground, if you look at the Ukrainian map, that the Russians have made tremendous gains across the country. There's been a tremendous cost to them. Their casualties are high. They've gotten even higher. This has not been an easy war for Putin. His losses are horrific. So he's probably looking for an exit strategy. I will say this. Ukraine has lost a lot of land. There's probably going to have to be some type of a compromise. I think the only person with credibility to get both parties to the table is Donald Trump. The rest of the world has basically been engaged in a very sad spectator sport. Trump will probably put this to an end quickly, but I don't know what that compromise looks like, but we have got to stop the carnage.
Well, Congressman, you're back in Washington with your colleagues here with the to-do list in the lame duck session, and I would love to get into some of the asks, beginning with funding the government. You know, everyone's going to start running their countdown clocks. Tomorrow is 1 month out from December 20 and the lapse of funding. There is a debate right now about whether you should clear the decks for Donald Trump by extending, by kicking the can well into next year. Some say March, some say September. Others say no, Donald Trump should have a hand in writing the next budget that comes to the nation. What do you think?
Well, I think we need to hear from President Trump on this. I'm very solicitous of his thoughts. The fiscal year began for our country October 1st. We have a continuing resolution, as you alluded to December 20th. By that time, we either have to have a budget in place and a deal or go into next year. It'd be my vote to basically get it done this year. President Trump's going to have a lot on his plate with budget reconciliation, with taxes, and other issues that the nation, the border, has to be addressed. We don't want to necessarily have this appropriation situation on his plate unless he wants it on his plate. So the reality is, the sooner we get a budget done, the better. Clean it up and let President Trump go into a new, clean administration, a new year. However, if President Trump feels differently, we'll be glad to entertain that.
Okay. So if it were up to you, would you prefer March or September? And would that continuing resolution include the millions of dollars, the hundreds of millions that the Biden administration asked for to clean up from the hurricanes that partially impacted your state?
Well, certainly we need disaster relief. I don't know what that package looks like. President Biden put forth a letter today to the Speaker of the House in that regard. Ultimately, I think we need some type of a disaster relief, but that would be in terms of a supplemental addition to the budget. My preference would be get a deal done on the overall appropriations package by December 20th. There's some problems with that practically, though. The House and Senate are $100 billion apart. The Senate is much higher. I don't know whether or not Senator Schumer would deal. He'd be a fool not to deal, given what we're going to see with Republicans in charge of the House, Senate, and White House next year. But once again, I think the sooner we get a budget for our country, the better. I would have preferred to see a budget September 30th going into October 1st. We didn't get that. So I would take December 20th. But if not, we'll go into March.
That's the view from a member of the Appropriations Committee, we should note. With your interest in energy, Congressman, and your position in Congress, I would love to hear from you on Donald Trump's pick for the Energy Department. Everyone is obsessing over a lot of other picks, but not so much Chris Wright. He's the CEO of Liberty Energy, said to be an innovator when it comes to fracking, and someone who will look to undo the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the incentives that came along with it. Is he the right pick for the job?
Well, I applaud President-elect Trump for this choice. I don't know Mr. Wright. We have reached out. Hopefully I'll be able to speak with him because my subcommittee, the Energy and Water Subcommittee, will fund the Department of Energy, which includes the NNSA, which has the nuclear arsenal, but also all of the energy endeavors. So I do look forward to meeting and visiting with Mr. Wright, as well as Governor Burgum, who's going to chair the Energy Council. He's going to have Interior, but he's also going to have this special new Executive Branch Energy Council. Ultimately, I'll be responsible for funding or not funding those endeavors. But a good choice, looks like an oil and gas person. He's got good competence. He's got good business experience. I was also pleased to see that he tends to be pro-nuclear. That's my space in Congress. I'm the most pro-nuclear power congressperson in Congress. I'm looking for somebody with whom I can continue that great work that has been bipartisan, bicameral, and has gone through several administrations to promote American nuclear.
I've been seeing a video that Mr. Wright said there is no climate crisis and we are not in the midst of an energy transition either. It's a quote that has been repeatedly used over the past couple of days since Donald Trump mentioned his name. I won't try to relitigate the climate element with you here, but when we talk about energy transition, he's presumably talking about green. Will he, in fact, bring an energy transition back to nuclear? Congressman, you just brought this up, and we know that the great need for clean and renewable energy here, and in this case, uninterruptible energy from a nuclear source for the data centers that are popping up like weeds all over the country, will have to be addressed in this next administration. What would the new energy secretary do, and what would you do in Congress to help him to that end?
Well, I thank you for that question. I have worked with the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration on a very pro-nuclear portfolio. All three secretaries, major secretaries of energy, whether it was Moniz, Perry, or Granholm, have worked with me on those endeavors. So we have moved forward. There's bipartisan and bicameral support for that. I would expect that to continue under Secretary Wright, because I know that President Trump is infinitely pro-new nuclear. So that is important. So it's going to be a continuation of the funding model I have out for fiscal 25, built on fiscal 24. It's a good, solid pro-nuclear portfolio. Nuclear energy will be part of clean, carbon-free, reliable, resilient energy. So I think we're going to continue to work in that direction, build on what we have. America has moved into this space. We're strong in this space, but we do need to get better. Our foes are good at it. Our friends are good at it. So we need to continue to get better at it.
Donald Trump is on his way to Texas for the big SpaceX Starship launch. We're going to carry that here on Bloomberg around 5 o'clock. In our remaining moment, Congressman, from your perch on the Science Committee, how important is this flight test to succeed for Elon Musk and for NASA to continue their planning to go to Mars?
I had the privilege of meeting Elon Musk when President Trump brought him to our conference last week. And of course, what did I speak with Elon about? Nuclear energy. I gave him my card and I said, let's talk nuclear. But I applaud Elon with what he's done. I wish him every success in his endeavors in space. And I think NASA and the country and the world can learn from what he's doing. I applaud him. I compliment him, and I wish him future success.
Well, the chopsticks are going to be waiting, Congressman. We'll all be watching together. Chuck Fleischmann, Republican from Tennessee, with us live from Capitol Hill. It's good to see you, sir. Thank you for the insights today on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Donald Trump is headed to Texas today. You might have heard me mention with Congressman Chuck Fleischmann. On his way to Texas, Brownsville, for the big launch. This is SpaceX Starship, 5 p.m. Eastern Time is the start of the launch window. We're going to carry this for you. This is the latest flight test that you heard Donald Trump talking about. Remember the chopsticks on the last one? The booster comes back down. They catch it at the pad. All that's supposed to happen. And the weather is looking good. So between 5 and 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, you can always count on Bloomberg to bring you these launches. This is a big one, though. You've got the president-elect there with the buddy-in-chief, Elon Musk, all watching the launch. And a lot of this, of course, has to do with our return to the moon, with our return to Mars. And each stage, each flight test is critically important to stay on track. So we're going to have a lot more from Texas a little bit later on today, as reality may be setting in at Mar-a-Lago. Not about SpaceX or Elon Musk, but about Matt Gaetz. Headline in the New York Times, Gaetz may not be confirmed. Trump admits he's pushing him and others anyway. Maggie Haberman, Jonathan Swan reporting that Donald Trump has been on the phone specifically calling senators to pressure them, knowing that we may have even odds here in getting Matt Gaetz, the now former Florida congressman, approved to run the Department of Justice. It's where we start our conversation with our political panel. Jeanne Zaino is back with us today, Senior Democracy Fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, of course, Democratic analyst and Bloomberg Politics contributor. And Lisa Camooso Miller, Republican strategist, former RNC Communications Director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Prepare for a great conversation. Great to see both of you here. Jeanne, your thought on this. We've been talking about Matt Gaetz since last week when the name first dropped here. Donald Trump is hearing all the same stuff that we are, but is now appealing directly to senators. Will it work?
We don't know yet. The reality is that these allegations, particularly for somebody who is nominated to be the Attorney General of the United States, the chief law enforcement official, whether these allegations are true or not, and of course he denies them, these are disqualifying. I mean, think back 20 years. Tom Daschle, loses the nomination because he didn't pay taxes. Bill Richardson, that's how it used to work. Now we've got somebody who is accused of these, crimes, if they are true. And again, he says they are not. These would be disqualifying. But the reality is you've got members of Congress who say, or the Senate who say, that they want to give the president's nominees a fair hearing. And we'll have to see if that's true. But the reality is that Donald Trump hears what we're all hearing, and that is these are disqualifying allegations.
Less than even odds of being confirmed to the Senate. The line in Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swann's column, Lisa. Enter Elon Musk, who is not only supporting Matt Gaetz, but he takes to Twitter, to X, and writes, he is the Judge Dredd America needs to clean up a corrupt system and put powerful bad actors in prison. Gaetz will be our hammer of justice. How comic book is this going to get in the next couple of weeks?
Well, Jill, we're definitely on another side of things. There's no question about it. And the thing about this nomination is that I think we're all waiting to see, right? There are definitely a lot of questions about whether or not Matt Gaetz can be confirmed, but also, too, don't forget that we're living in a very different time. Donald Trump has got the control of the Senate, he's got control of the House, but he also really likes to win. And so, to me, I think that he's hearing everything that we're hearing. I think he's still very much behind Matt Gaetz as a candidate for Attorney General. He's going to do everything he can to see that he can make that happen. But also, too, he's not going to go far enough. He's not going to go so far that he's going to lose that nomination himself and have to go back to the drawing board. So I think a lot of things are up in the air. Like Jeanne said, I think we just don't yet know. So we have to continue to watch. But I do think that there are a lot of things in his favor that are happening. And that is that he's got people like Elon Musk. And he's got, by the way, the support of the base of the party really behind him, right? I had someone tell me the other day that even the folks who aren't really paying very close attention to Matt Gaetz are saying that they're in favor of him because he is an outside of the box candidate. And so that too is something that has to be fueling Donald Trump's thought process as it goes through and as he continues to make phone calls to the U.S. Senate about confirming.
Now, of course, the Ethics Committee is going to meet tomorrow about whether or not to release this report. Jeanne, Speaker Johnson says no. It would set a horrible precedent for former members, even though there are some instances where this has happened before. But the top Republican on this committee, the chair, Michael Guest, says he doesn't care, and the panel will act independent of whatever the speaker says based on when they meet. The ranking member, his Democratic counterpart, Susan Wild, says she wants the report out. So we can all agree this is going to happen, right? Whether it takes place publicly for the committee or the lawyer is out there talking on behalf now of 4 women apparently connected to Matt Gaetz, or as you put yesterday in the FBI report. So this information will be available to senators who make this decision, right?
Oh, it absolutely will be. I mean, the FBI check alone, they're going to be able to pick up as much, if not more, quite frankly, than was picked up in the House Ethics. The House Ethics Committee, we don't know if they'll release it, but don't forget, there's 10 members of the committee, 28 or 29 staffers. The ranking member on the Democratic side, you just mentioned, Wild, lost re-election. What's to stop any of these people from releasing to journalists, parts of this or in full? So I think we get it out here. But I think part of the troubling aspect of all of this, and whether we're talking about, this nominee, Matt Gaetz, or Peter Hegseth in DOD, is we are not talking about qualifications to run these departments. All of the focus has been on these allegations of sexual misconduct and otherwise, obviously disqualifying. Yeah. But it should also be distinguished that these are massive departments. I mean, the DOD alone, $800 billion annual budget. What qualifications does somebody like Pete Hegseth have to run that department? 2 million people he'd be responsible for that the DOD employs. Maybe he has those qualifications, but we don't hear about them or talk about them because all of the focus, once again, has been on these, sort of really troubling allegations, disqualifying, but not having to do with the qualifications of these individuals. And that's not to mention Tulsi Gabbard, or of course, maybe the worst offender, RFK Jr., who has, 0 qualifications in the area of health and human services. A good attorney on environment, but not health and human services.
You start to wonder if Matt Gaetz, the best thing that ever happened to Pete Hegseth or RFK Jr., Lisa, considering the fact that Hegseth reportedly paid to settle a sexual assault case. Lisa, you worked for a Republican speaker in Denny Hastert. You know how this stuff works. When Mike Johnson says, I don't want the ethics report released, what does that mean when the chairman says we're going to do it anyway?
Well, Joe, there used to be a joke in Washington. I don't know that it's still the case, but if you want a story told, tell somebody on Capitol Hill. And it certainly is the case. I mean, these kinds of things definitely have a way of making themselves into the conversation. But, and I'm reflecting on what Jeanne said. I'm reflecting on sort of the way we've covered Donald Trump for all these years. The truth is that I think we're falling into the same trap. And that is that, yes, there is a process for confirmation. There is a process that involves the FBI, involves background checks and all of those other things. And ordinarily, those are disqualifiers. But look, in a resounding way, the American electorate voted for Donald Trump and put him back in office in charge of the biggest job there ever was. So to me, we also have to reflect on the fact that this is sort of a continuation of a conversation we probably need to be having. And that's, what is it that's qualifying and disqualifying in these jobs in this day and age? Do I think that we should refer back to the way that things once were? Absolutely. And Jeanne and I and you, Joe, have been watching this long enough to know that that's the way that this business is done. And thank goodness there are processes in place that will hopefully catch some of these candidates that perhaps aren't the best qualified for these jobs. But also, too, let's not fall into the trap of following all of the side noise and the outside noise that's conflating the fact that Donald Trump is still fighting for all of these candidates. And so far, his record has been pretty good over the course of the last couple of months and years.
So I'm glad you said all of that, Lisa. Finish the thought then. What are the chances that all three, Hegseth, Gaetz, RFK Jr., are confirmed? Because Donald Trump says he's got the mandate to make that happen.
You've heard me say it too. I think the rules are different. I think the playbook is different. And I think that, if Donald Trump has his mind set on getting these people into place, he's going to do what he has in his power as the president of the United States to do that. At the horror and the shock of all the people inside of Washington, D.C., including myself, who are concerned about these people as candidates that should be in these roles. And so to me, I think that the chance, if there's, goodness knows, my crystal ball is as clear as anybody's in this town, Joe, but I'll say this, that I think that it's very possible that we could see these kinds of people get into these roles more readily than ever before in the history of the United States.
Yeah. Well, all right, Jeanne, what role do Democrats then play on the committees that are having these hearings? Do Democrats throw their hands up and say, you know what, you want this team? Go ahead. Let's see where you are in 2 years. Clear them. Or is there going to be a real throwdown, a real fight by Democrats knowing that they will likely be confirmed anyway?
Well, they will continue to be the loyal opposition. I think you look at the Judiciary Committee. Poor 91-year-old Chuck Grassley is the incoming chair of that, has got to manage this. And you're going to see Dick Durbin and the Democrats. They are going to call, if Matt Gaetz comes to the Judiciary Committee, they will call witnesses. They will make this a spectacle. They will make Republicans go on the record and say they support somebody who is charged with sex with an underage woman or girl, who has paid for sex, who has used illegal drugs, all of these allegations. So these are going to be hearings of the kind, just think back to Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill. Yep. That's what they will do. And that's what the Republicans are so not looking forward to. That's one reason why some of them want the report to come out. They're hoping that they can avoid having to go through this hearing. But these will be hearings for all of us to watch and all of us to see. But again, what we won't be talking about is what Donald Trump is saying he's going to be doing, including yesterday, that he will use the U.S. military to deport people who are here illegally. Regardless of what you think about immigration, the use of the U.S. military domestically, that is an enormous change in the way we run this country. He said on Truth Social yesterday, absolutely true, when somebody posted he would do that. And that has sort of gone under-reported, under-discussed, and just imagined what that would be like, the U.S. military out in full force, because of the real nasty allegations we're hearing on the other side. And that should be balanced. We should try to balance both of them. But I'll tell you, if these hearings come to fruition, there will be no balancing. We will all be all in on Matt Gaetz because it's going to be wild.
Oh, my God, yeah. Just wait to cover these hearings. This is a great panel and a really smart conversation. I appreciate it. Lisa Camooso Miller and Jeanne Zaino, thank you so much both for the insights.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We'll have tabs on the markets for us throughout the hour here as we cover politics from Washington, D.C. We saw a bit of a swoon in the market earlier with the news from Ukraine using the ATACMS missiles provided by the U.S. offensively against Russia, which is announcing a new nuclear doctrine, though it does seem that the markets have settled a bit since then. Turning to the matter at hand in Washington, that's the transition, of course, in the looming confirmation battles for some of the more controversial figures who Donald Trump has named, beginning with former Congressman Matt Gaetz, tapped to run the Department of Justice to be the next Attorney General. As Kailey mentioned, Congressman Sean Casten, a Democrat from Illinois, is leading a letter from House Democrats urging the Ethics Committee to release its report into Matt Gaetz, knowing that the Ethics Committee will be voting on this matter tomorrow and that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has called on the committee to keep that report under wraps. Congressman Casten joins us now live from Capitol Hill. Congressman, it's good to see you. This report seems to be the worst kept secret in Washington. Do you know what's in there? Would it keep Matt Gaetz from being the next Attorney General?
So the report has not been released. The Ethics Committee, by tradition, keeps a tight hold on these things. We've seen the leaks that have come out, as you have. We've seen the stories about people saying that 17-year-old girls were drugged and statutorily raped at parties by Matt Gaetz. We've not seen what's in the report. The Ethics Committee has the authority to release that report, and I think what scares a lot of us is that we saw the last time that Trump was in the White House that he not only surrounds himself with sexual predators, people who are credibly accused of sexual assault, but suppresses that information. Remember, he suppressed the FBI investigation into Brett Kavanaugh. Remember that Donald Trump himself is an adjudicated rapist. And so if we don't compel the release of that information, we have no guarantee that a Republican-led Senate will actually care about whether an Attorney General in the United States has been accused of sexual assault. So we need to get the information out there. We need to make sure that the Senate has the tools to fulfill their advice and consent function, and then make sure that we put public pressure on them to ensure that they do.
Well, of course, we should note that the former Congressman Matt Gaetz has denied any wrongdoing amid these allegations, and even attorneys for two of the alleged people that had relations with Matt Gaetz have said their interactions were consensual. But Congressman, as we consider this here, knowing that the Speaker has said this would set a bad precedent as Mr. Gaetz is no longer a member of the House of Representatives, is there a precedent concern here? Could the House Ethics Committee in the future be used in a way that it was not intended to if this is done?
Look, number one, the House Ethics Committee does have a history. In past years, they have released reports after members have come out. Number two, make no mistake, Matt Gaetz is an extremely smart guy. He is also less than completely honest. All of us understood that he resigned early in order to avoid this report coming to light. If he is nervous about what's in the report, that speaks volumes. And with respect to Mr. Johnson, I would simply point out that Mr. Johnson told us when he was running for Speaker, if you want to know what I believe, just read the Bible. When Jesus said, what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, I wonder who Mike Johnson actually is thinking of by the least of these. If you have somebody, Donald Trump raped a woman, is Mike Johnson going to look out for that, or is he going to be a rubber stamp? Does he care that there are credible challenges against Matt Gaetz? I wish this didn't sound partisan. I wish that we trusted the Republicans in the House and Senate to defend the least of these. But the fact that somebody is saying, I am innocent, trust me, and please don't disclose the information, a little dubious.
Congressman, we heard from Elon Musk, who of course is playing a pretty big role in the transition of this administration, apparently will play a large role once the administration is off and running. He says that Matt Gaetz, quote, is the Judge Dredd. America needs to clean up a corrupt system and put powerful bad actors in prison. Gaetz, he says, will be our hammer of justice. That's a direct quote, going on to say that the allegations that we're talking about here, quote, amount to less than nothing, unquote. How would you respond to Elon Musk?
Look, Elon Musk is not an elected official. Elon Musk does not represent anybody, and hardly, I think, is a voice of reason in our society. He said that his own goal is to go live on Mars. Okay, fine. The only reason we're talking about Elon Musk is because he's rich. We have a separate question. Do we want the Attorney General of the United States to be somebody who has a dedicated commitment to ensuring that the law applies to every American equally without preference? That seems a very low bar. If your view is that the Attorney General's job is to be some comic book figure that is out to implement retribution, whatever that is a deeply anti-American idea.
Congressman, we may care about Elon Musk because he is the richest man in the world, but he also happens to be a massive government contractor, including agreements between his company SpaceX and NASA. We're expected to see today, and the president-elect is expected to attend the launch of a heavy rocket, the sixth Starship launch, which of course is integral to NASA's efforts to hopefully one day get back to the moon and then maybe to Mars. And I wonder how concerned you are about Elon Musk's more active role, it seems, with this transition, with this president-elect, knowing that the government was reliant on him for many such endeavors.
You know, I think there's a larger conversation there that is the concern about our campaign finance system in the wake of the Citizens United decision. The government that our founders intended, the government that our laws were designed prior to Citizens United, is you had to disclose if you were spending money to elect political figures. There is an emoluments clause in the Constitution. You cannot be independently profiting, and we've hidden all that in the guts of our campaign finance system. A functioning Congress going into the next term, given all the circumstances you just described, where the richest person in the world put hundreds of millions of dollars to elect someone into government and is then running to get those contracts, a Congress fulfilling its duty as a check and balance would have robust oversight, robust investigations, robust subpoenas, and if in fact SpaceX is the best technology to provide those needs and it's a fair and competitive bid process, there's nothing to worry about there. But I think we are all concerned, having seen what happened in the last Congress, that the leadership in the Republican Party is so petrified of making Donald Trump angry and so unwilling to stand up for those constitutional principles that we have to ask this question of, is there corruption happening in the light of day that will be allowed to continue, which ruins this beautiful American republic that all of us benefit from. This is bigger than just Elon Musk. It is a question of, like, do we want to make sure that there is no cash for favors in our politics? Congress has the ability to oversight and protect against that. I hope that we do.
Well, Congressman, knowing that Elon Musk will have the ear of the president, do you find a silver lining potentially in what he might steer Donald Trump to when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the development of electric vehicles, for instance? And is there an opportunity to collaborate on nuclear when this new Congress and this new administration begin?
We'll see. Speculating on an unappointed, unconfirmed person who's whispering in the ear of a political figure, I'm not sure that's hugely productive. I don't think that Elon Musk's involvement in politics is because he wanted to convince Donald Trump to love electric vehicles, right? I think that's a third-order question. I do think that a lot of us in the energy community are broadly concerned that the last time Trump was in the White House, he fought to raise the price of oil. You'll recall he called the Saudis and said, I need you to curtail production to raise the price of oil because it's hurting our oil manufacturers. He's got voices in his head who are saying we're losing market share in the United States. Coal consumption in the United States is collapsing. Oil consumption is flat. They want to export because they can't compete in the United States. What we really need in the White House is someone who is committed to competitive markets, to making sure that the lowest cost technology wins. And what all of us know is that if you have a solar panel on your roof, you don't pay for electricity anymore. If you have a transmission wire that can connect your cheap electricity to a higher priced part of the grid, then markets work. And I think what we also know is that the Trump administration is going to work very hard to raise the price of energy to protect the oil and gas sector that can't compete. And that's not only bad for the climate, it's also bad for the economy. What influence Musk might have with electric vehicles, I think, is a third-order impact beyond that larger question of the stress that our economy is going to feel under a Trump administration.
Well, Congressman, before we can get there to the incoming administration, there is this session of Congress to finish out in a spending fight that needs to be fought. Obviously, we're facing a deadline here of December 20th. In what form do you expect ultimately a shutdown aversion will take, and where does $100 billion in requested disaster relief fit into the picture?
Well, I think we all heard Johnson say this week that he wanted to do a short-term continuing resolution that would put the disaster package in there. What we've all struggled with through this whole session is that there's a war within the Republican Party between itself. I think its Freedom Caucus would like to oppose any spending package. The more sort of Main Street ends of the Republican Party would like to negotiate this in good faith. If I had to guess right now, I'd say that they punt until the next Congress through a CR. But we'll see. I think they're having a lot of fights within themselves on how to get through there. And we've basically run this entire year on a continuing resolution, arguably the last 2 years on a continuing resolution, as a result of the fact that the Republican Party, particularly in the House, has struggled with governance. And so we just keep limping along and kicking through last year's priorities or the year before's priorities. I expect that will continue through this term, but I would love to be pleasantly surprised.
All right, Congressman, we appreciate your time. That is the Democrat from Illinois, Sean Casten, joining us live from Capitol Hill.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We mark on this Tuesday 1,000 days of war between Russia and Ukraine. And this deep into this conflict, things do seem to be escalating after the U.S. granted Ukraine permission to use U.S.-made weapons for longer-range strikes into Russia. And Ukraine took advantage of that newly granted privilege by striking a military base in Russian territory, leading Moscow to respond with threat regarding nuclear weapons. Putin signing a decree allowing Russia to fire nuclear weapons in response to conventional attacks, including things like drone strikes. So at a time in which this feels like it's getting a whole lot hotter, we heard from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky about a path toward this being over.
We must push Russia toward just peace. Every blow and every threat from Russia must be met with firm sanctions. For 1,000 days, it has been crucial to radically reduce Russia's ability to fund its war through oil sales.
Speaking to the European Parliament earlier today, quite the reaction from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, reacting to the use of those ATACMS missiles that Kailey just mentioned. Quote, "We will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we will act accordingly," unquote. That's where we begin with Bloomberg's David Gura, who's still in Rio de Janeiro, where they are just now wrapping the G20 summit, Joe Biden's last G20. David, this is the topic on the ground there today. What are you hearing?
President Biden making his way to the airport. He is done with this summit. But those words from Sergei Lavrov had a seismic effect on this summit while it was wrapping up today. Everyone was listening. Indeed, it moved markets when he spoke about the changes to the Russian nuclear doctrine and the fact that he saw the move as escalatory. You know, it's interesting, the White House didn't immediately confirm this. I watched an interview yesterday that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, did with the PBS NewsHour. He wouldn't confirm that the U.S. was giving those missiles to Ukraine and allowing them to use them explicitly. Of course, we did see that overnight. We had confirmation from Russia, but not from Ukraine. And I should say Vladimir Zelensky wanted to be here for this event, wanted to make his case for continued multilateral support of his effort to fight off Russia in his home country. And that request for information was rebuffed by President Lula here of Brazil. But this has come up over and over again on meetings on the sidelines and really shaped the last day of this session. There was a pivotal bilateral meeting this morning between President Xi of China and Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany. As we've been talking about, Chancellor Olaf Scholz had a conversation with Vladimir Putin a few days ago, and he was briefing world leaders, including President Xi, about this. But there is this variable here that looms large, guys. Sort of what President Biden is able to do in terms of setting policy, allowing for the use of these ammunitions and weapons, and what's going to happen in just a couple of months' time when he leaves the White House and President Trump comes back.
All right, Bloomberg correspondent David Gura still live in Rio de Janeiro for us. Thank you so much. Now, as we consider the words of Sergei Lavrov today, he also said that we are strongly in favor of doing everything not to allow nuclear war to happen at the same time that this nuclear-oriented decree was signed by the Russian president. So I wonder to what extent we take those words at face value.
I don't know how you square those two. There are questions about whether this bluster might be an attempt to take advantage of this lame duck session that we're in right now in advance of Donald Trump taking office. But this is something that we can only wonder right now. Remarkable, though, to think that President Zelensky waited only hours after Joe Biden gave him permission to use those missiles.
Yeah, pretty incredibly quick in terms of action here, though they had been waiting for this kind of move from the U.S. administration for this permission to be granted for some time. So we wanted to get into all of this with Kailey Greco. She is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and an expert in the weapons of war. Kailey, would love to hear from you on just what you make of the escalatory nature it seems we've seen from both sides in just the last 24 hours. How does Ukraine respond to the threat of Russia saying, if you strike us again, we could use a nuclear weapon? Does that mean this might be the first and only time the Ukraine used these ATACMS in this way?
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I will say that I'm not surprised by the Russian response. They had signaled earlier that this could actually be the response over the summer. They had discussed that they were revising their nuclear doctrine to lower the nuclear threshold for conventional attacks. And so what we saw today was essentially a confirmation of that, signing the order that it is now official policy. I think, it's interesting here. We're playing a very dangerous game of chicken on both sides, essentially, to see which side's going to blink first and stand down. Whether, my tendency is to think that the Ukrainians will be likely to try to call Putin's bluff. I think the question will be whether the Biden administration and also European allies are prepared to call his bluff in this way, or we'll see it as perhaps this is a step too far and it's worth backing down.
Well, I'm struck by the response, which was a non-response by the U.S. It's like Joshua in war games. The only way to win is not to play. Kailey, was that the right angle for the U.S. government today?
Yes, I think it was, because it does allow for, especially if we decide to back down and that maybe this is going to be a one-off, I think it allows us to do it in a way that it creates some ambiguity so we don't have as much of a reputational cost if we decide to revise this policy. So if we've never confirmed that we authorized this, that these were actually, the ATACMS that were used, and it doesn't happen again, it's sort of an easier way, I think, to manage a reversal of the policy. Without sort of, taking a reputational hit. So I think that was very smart.
Well, and when we consider the U.S.'s decision-making here to allow Ukraine to use these weapons at longer range and strike Russian territory, that's not necessarily being granted by all allies of Ukraine alike, Kailey. Germany, for example, and the Chancellor Olaf Scholz still incredibly reluctant to allow Ukraine use of their Taurus long-range missile systems. There's been a lot of talk about that in the last few days. What would providing those weapons to Ukraine mean differently? Or is this kind of exactly the same scenario-wise as the U.S. decision on ATACMS?
Yes, it's exactly the same. And, the Germans have been much more cautious in what they provided. But I think it's worth noting that even our French and British allies that have been, I would say, more forward-leaning in providing longer-range systems to the Ukrainians have still not provided permission to use those weapons on Russian territory. And I think Putin's nuclear threats will certainly probably cause them to pause that rather than follow suit with the United States in that regard. But I think the really important thing here to mention is that none of these long-range systems, because they're only available in very small numbers, are likely to actually transform Ukraine's what Ukraine can accomplish in the war right now. It's in a very tough position, largely because it lacks sufficient manpower to hold the front, and it's being gradually pushed back by the Russians. And these long-range strikes are not going to change that reality. And so, you do have to wonder, is it worth the escalation risks here, given what it can actually accomplish militarily?
Well, I guess I'd ask you that. What kind of damage can President Zelensky do? What kind of ground could Ukraine gain with the use of these weapons in time to strengthen its hand at the negotiating table, realizing that's a pretty short window, it looks like, for when Donald Trump comes into office?
Yeah, I actually don't think this is about Ukraine gaining more ground. I think it's actually an attempt to try to save ground that Ukraine has, and particularly the Kursk region, where Ukraine went in August and captured this Russian territory in this surprise operation. And the Russians are gearing up to, it seems, take back that territory. There's about 50,000 troops in the Kursk area, including North Koreans. And so I think part of the decision here was to try to allow the Ukrainians to be able to conduct these long-range strikes in the Kursk area only, so that they could hit supply depots, ammunition storage, any concentrations of troops to try to disrupt those Russian operations. And hopefully, if Ukraine can hold on to that Kursk territory, they could use it as a bargaining chip at the negotiating table.
Kelly, I want to ask you about another development today. The IAEA saying that Iran has agreed to stop producing uranium enriched to the level at which it's required for nuclear weapons, that 60% production level. They say they've implemented measures aimed at stopping the increase of Iran's stockpile. But I wonder just the status of the stockpile as it is, even if they're taking these steps. Kelly, how much does Iran already have at its disposal if it wants to move forward with weapons?
Yes, I mean, most estimates that I've heard from, nuclear experts that watch Iran closely is that they're very close, probably, months away if they wanted to from being able to have sufficient amounts and be able to create, a nuclear weapon. I think it's a really interesting signal that they're sending, kind of extending an olive branch, it seems, in some ways. And it's interesting this comes after the reporting we heard about Musk meeting with the Iranians. It's, I think, an important signal, and I'd be curious to see how the future Trump administration reacts.
Well, considering the potential impact of the future Trump administration and seeing the ceasefire struck in Lebanon that was framed as some sort of a gift for the incoming president, do you see all of the hot wars, Ukraine, you can add what's happening in Israel to the list here, potentially resolving or at least advancing to the next phase under a new White House?
Yeah, I mean, it is really something to watch, isn't it? That we've had these wars, certainly for the last year, 2 very active wars, one in Europe, one in the Middle East. The Ukraine war, of course, has gone on longer. And right as it's winding, Biden's administration is winding down, a lot of these parties are now thinking that they're better off negotiating, knowing that the Trump administration is coming. And so I think there's something here that we should be thinking about as the United States about whether we have actually inadvertently, perhaps, enabled these wars to drag on because we haven't really provided any restraints, or not very many restraints, on our allies in these wars, and whether that really served our interests and served, either Israeli or Ukrainian interests. And so it is quite remarkable that we might actually see at least some kind of freezing of these conflicts pretty soon into a Trump administration.
Some big questions to answer. Kelly, it's great to have you back. Kelly Grieco, Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center. Thank you so much for the insights and analysis as we track what's happening in Ukraine on this 1,000th day of its war with Russia. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power as we transition to the economy next. An important conversation with Joe Lavorgna, live from New York, here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm just realizing as it's Tuesday, that means we're officially now 2 weeks since Election Day. 2 weeks that for Joe Mathieu and myself felt more like 2 months, possibly.
Oh, no. They know.
2 years.
I think that goes for a nation.
Yeah, because a lot has happened since we learned that Donald Trump would become the president-elect, as he has wasted no time filling out what his second administration will look like. But he is spending time on one role in particular, maybe more time than he first intended.
That's right.
On Treasury Secretary, after a lot of infighting has played out quite publicly.
Yeah, this has been quite remarkable to witness. We're still not done.
Yeah.
We don't know who will be the Treasury Secretary, but we do know who will not. And that's because Howard Lutnick, who was said to be on the short list, of course, co-chair of the transition, has been named Commerce Secretary. That's the most recent one that we got here. according to reports. And Nancy Cook has been driving a lot of our coverage here on the transition for us from Bloomberg here in Washington, our senior national correspondent for politics with us at the table. Nancy, it's great to see you. We've got to be getting close to the big one here, right? For Bloomberg, at least, it's the big one. Usually you see Treasury come first because that's the less controversial pick. Why is it so hard this time?
There has just been a tremendous amount of infighting over the Treasury pick that has really delayed it. And so a week or so ago, Scott Bessent, who I know you have had on the show before, was really seen as the front runner. Then Howard Lutnick decided, he is running the personnel side of the transition. He decided he wanted the job for himself. And told President-elect Trump that. And basically there's been sort of a lot of infighting within the transition team over who's going to get that post. Trump has grown tired of the leaks, tired of sort of the back and forth on this, and is now considering a whole new roster of new candidates who have not been involved in the infighting. Yeah. So our reporting shows that he is supposed to meet with Kevin Warsh, who was a Fed governor, tomorrow. He's also supposed to meet with Mark Rowan of Apollo. Senator Bill Hagerty, who's been another guest of the show, is in the mix. And so really the pool has expanded as the infighting sort of dragged on for the week.
Well, and it did make me wonder when Bloomberg has reported this as well, though Donald Trump, of course, hasn't yet made it official that it could be Howard Lutnick for Commerce. If there's been so much jockeying between the two, if they're both to serve in the administration together, working toward economic goals, that might create some strife internally if they actually have to work together in that capacity. And I wonder if that actually means that if Lutnick gets a formal cabinet role, that Bessent can't get one.
Well, we reported yesterday that they had offered Scott Bessent. They had spoken to him about both the Treasury position, but also there was talks about putting him in the White House at the National Economic Council. And so, they have floated different jobs for him. I think it's unlikely that the two of them both end up in the administration at this point. But again, the Trump team has not officially announced Lutnick yet. And so I think that, we won't be totally sure until we see that announcement come from them directly.
National Economic Council, or Council of Economic Advisors, the two agencies, if you will, or the two groups inside the White House advising the president, it's been suggested might actually have more influence, play a greater role in the administration because they're in the White House with Donald Trump, which is exactly how he operates. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, well, Treasury Secretary is its own cabinet position.
Sure,
you have a plane, you have a staff. Yep. You're seen as sort of more of a principal and a peer, I would say, to the president. But the National Economic Council, you have to remember, in Trump's first term, was led by Larry Kudlow, who is one of Trump's favorite people. He was in the running for Treasury Secretary as well, but sort of took himself out of it because he's a Fox News commentator, and I think didn't want to disrupt his life to that example. But that role, when Larry Kudlow occupied it, and even Gary Cohn before that, was a real powerhouse because your office is in the White House. You're sort of in all those meetings. My question really for the economic policy making this Trump term is that it was so riddled with infighting last time, particularly in the trade space over what to do with tariffs, what to do on the policy towards China. You had some people who wanted, tons of tariffs, some people who wanted more free trade. So I will be looking, once Trump announces economic team, sort of where the fissures are, particularly on how these different players are going to view trade.
Well, and that makes the role of USTR very important, right? Would one of these who it doesn't get the Treasury position potentially get that one instead?
USTR is really an open question, and I think where Robert Lighthizer ends up is an open question. Our reporting shows that he does not want to go to USTR again, even though that's a role that, he did quite well and effectively in the first Trump term. And so I don't think he's going to get Treasury Secretary. He doesn't want USTR again. Where does he land? Because he has been such a Trump ally. Same thing with Linda McMahon. She is the other co-chair of the transition. We know Trump has interviewed her for Commerce. If Lutnick actually ends up getting the official nod for Commerce, where does Linda McMahon go? So there's a lot of real loyalists in the Trump orbit who may end up without jobs.
Fascinating. Well, we know Nancy Cook will be covering all of it for us as the pieces move about the board here. Bloomberg National Politics reporter Nancy Cook. And we want to talk more about this kind of economic team and, frankly, what kind of policy it is they're really going to be pursuing once they are assembled, and turn back to Joe Livornia. He, of course, served in the first Trump White House as special assistant to the president and chief economist at the National Economic Council, and is now chief economist with SMB Nikko Securities. He's joining us from New York. Joe, would love to just get your take on how you're watching all of this play out, as, frankly, some of the names that Nancy just told us seem to be in contention here, like Kevin Warsh, might actually have some conflict with Donald Trump when it comes to the approach around policies like tariffs, for example. What do you think?
So I thought Nancy did a very good job reporting, but to me, I don't see it as infighting at all. I actually think it's healthy debate, and the press, I think, sometimes treats anything that Mr. Trump or President-elect Trump says as catnip. And I think you've got a lot of healthy debates, and so I think the infighting thing is very much overhyped. I could tell you that when I was there, and this was during the pandemic, there wasn't chaos, and that was typically the adjective people use. So I think we have to be a little bit more careful in terms of, I think, how we describe things. But in terms of the people, I mean, the president certainly has a great list of people who could take the role. I think what you're referring to as it relates to Kevin Warsh is a paper position he had back in 2011. The world has totally changed since then. So whether it's Kevin Warsh or Scott Bessent, in complementary roles, I think the nation would be well served. But I think the point is that the president-elect is making a very thorough, thoughtful decision on who he wants, and we have to applaud the fact that he's moving with patience and thinking about it.
Joe, thank you for that. Considering all the motion here and the commotion and the reporting that you may or may not think is totally accurate, at least describing the mood at Mar-a-Lago, you've been there. You know what this is like. You were chief economist, National Economic Council. Are you loving sitting back here watching what's going on from your perch, or are you actually in conversation with the transition team about taking on another role in this new White House?
No, I'm lucky that I get to be an outside observer and have some insight into Washington. And most importantly, the markets are moving, and it's making my day job more fun and interesting. It's great already, but we're making it great again. Poor pun, but you know what I mean. But no, it's pretty interesting in terms of what happens. And I do think, the people that the president is considering for Treasury, I think what's important is they're not folks that I think would be market negative by any means. And the president needs to put someone there who can articulate his policies, be a spokesperson for the markets, and do it in a way that inspires confidence. And I think what you're seeing now with the equities close to their all-time highs, and the market and Treasury market, basically not selling off further, I think right now is a vote of confidence that whoever the president picks will be someone that investors are largely comfortable with.
Well, as we consider the markets here and the public companies that trade on them, Joe, we did get some news from the CFO of Walmart, who told CNBC today that if Donald Trump implements the tariffs as expected, Walmart will likely have to raise some prices. I know we've discussed this with you at length, but this points to the inflationary concerns many have. Yes. Joe, and I wonder how many price increases you would expect to see.
So what I think what's very important is, again, as I said this, maybe there's 5 pillars of Trumponomics. One of them certainly is the tariffs, but also part of that is lower energy costs. And the energy share of the economy is larger than the imported goods share of the economy. And energy, if prices are down, has a more multiplicative effect in that it impacts other goods and prices, and lower costs actually can reduce the inflation rate. A tariff, theoretically, would be a one-off increase in the price level, so it's not inflationary. Moreover, what we saw from basically the 2017 to 2020 period is that producers largely, if not fully, absorbed that price increase. So to sound a bit like an economist, it depends on implementation. But I think people who are fixated on the tariffs as being inflationary and hurting, I think are missing the bigger picture and what the president-elect is trying to do, because it also involves deregulation, which is growth enhancing, lower tax rates on the corporate sector, and the intention is to increase productive capacity and supply, which lifts productivity and actually would lower inflation. So I don't like when people just fixate on one little narrow piece and don't look at the possible effects, the second and third order effects that tariffs may have that actually are not destabilizing or inflationary really in any appreciable way.
I'd like to ask you about Donald Trump's pick for Energy Secretary Chris Wright, said to be an innovator when it comes to fracking. This is drill, baby, drill. right? Assuming he's confirmed, Joe, what will it mean for oil prices in, say, the first year of Donald Trump's administration? Because the president-elect has made some big promises to lower energy prices by half.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we're going to get lower energy costs. I don't know where prices go. A lot will depend in part on the global economy and what the president decides to do with Iran and sanctions. So it's not just a U.S. phenomenon. But I do think there is going to be a very concerted effort to get energy production higher, to get gasoline prices back. I believe they averaged only around $2.50 a gallon under President Trump's first term. So if you can get prices down at the pump, that's savings that immediately go into middle and lower class pocketbooks, and people appreciate because, again, they could spend money on other goods and services. So energy costs are likely to fall. Where they go, I'm not sure at this point, but yes, you're correct. The drill mantra will be a day one initiative, and you'll see President Trump, through executive order, increase leasing and use of federal lands, exploration, offshore drilling. All those things will come back into the fold.
Well, we also expect that the president-elect, pretty soon after taking office, could use his executive order powers to address the border and migration. He confirmed yesterday reports that he'd look to use the military to enact the mass deportations or get those underway that he said he would on the campaign trail. How quickly do you think that would start to resonate in economic data, Joe?
I don't think that immigration actually has had as big an effect on the economy as people think. It's not as if the people who are coming over illegally are answering a government questionnaire as to whether they're working. And I'd argue that the president's potential policies already have worked to slow foot traffic. And of course, border security implementation will be much stricter. So you'll see the crossings come down. What happens beyond that, I can't say. But I don't think this notion somehow we're going to get this leftward shift in the labor supply curve and of all this inflation, I think, is very misleading. You saw under Trump's first term, you saw immigration and border crossings fall to a de minimis level, and yet you had very little inflation. You still had very good real wage growth. So I don't think this is going to be a factor impacting the larger economy or the labor market in particular.
Joe Lavorgna, SMBC, Nikos Securities America, a veteran of the first Trump White House. Joe, it's good to see you. Thank you for the insights, as always. Fascinating conversation, Kailey, as we wait for the next big one. Of course, commerce to be official, but also Treasury. This is something we might be waiting the rest of the week for, it sounds like. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.